Been working as a police officer in Detroit for a little more than a decade now. I've learned ghosts are not the scariest thing you'll find out there. Living people are far worse. However, one of my first scary experiences did involve something paranormal. It still roams around my mind. I was still a rookie back then, going out for my first night patrols. I was nervous, but also excited to get the chance to finally take matters into my own hands, to make the country a safer place and play my part. Yes, I was the classic naive kid with big dreams. I believed that becoming a cop was the closest thing to a superhero. I know better now. So anyway, I was sitting there, next to my partner in the car, driving around the neighborhood, patrolling. It was starting to get very late, around 11:35 p.m. We had seen nothing suspicious or out of the ordinary, so we're getting kind of bored. We parked in sort of a desolate part of the neighborhood, just watching the hours go by, and our radio flicked on. We were being dispatched to another place, as somebody had reported strange noises coming from an abandoned warehouse. My partner seemed more annoyed. I was ecstatic. Finally, something to do. I was so afraid I would get nothing to do on one of my first nights out. I was willing to check out every corner of that warehouse, even if the noise just turned to be a family of raccoons. So we set to check out what the ruckus might be. We drove deep into the neighborhood. You know how in Detroit, there are some places that were basically just left to rot. Well, the warehouse was located in one of those empty spots. Every house for miles seemed to be in a progressive state of decay. We began wondering who would have reported a noise disturbance in such a place. Nobody seemed to be living near. We got to the place and parked the car. The warehouse was basically just a rundown, barely standing building. The roof was missing in some parts. Most of the windows were just shards, and the walls were blackened almost all around. The doors were so rusty, it seemed that would become dust the moment we tried to open them. But that was not the only thing. The place had a vibe. I don't know how to describe it. It felt like a place you should stay away from. Both my partner and I knew it. He looked at me after taking a look at the building, suggested we both claim we found nothing inside to get out. I felt very tempted, but I needed to know I could handle this job and be a proper officer. It was time to improve myself. So I refused his offer and told him we should just give a quick look around, in case something might be going on inside. He rolled his eyes at me, but reluctantly agreed. We got our guns, flashlights ready, getting out of the car. I immediately noticed the heat. It was an early fall night, so it wasn't exactly cold. However, when we stepped out of the car, I swear, the temperature had risen like 20 degrees. I had to leave my jacket in the car. My partner just took this as another bad sign and insisted on leaving. He was also the very superstitious kind. I needed to just take a look around and felt like I'd truly done my job. We approached the factory, and the temperature was just soaring the closer we got to it, like it was a furnace. I now started to sweat. It felt almost like the heat was coming from the building itself. We got to one of the doors. I tried to grab the handle to pry it open. The moment I touched it, the metal felt burning hot. I cursed, immediately removing my hand. I looked at the handle, and even though it felt like it was red hot, it seemed completely normal. It left faint burning marks all over my hand, and my partner and I were beginning to freak out. He once again repeated, we should just leave the place and call the fire department. We turned around, and were about to head back when we had heard the screams and the pounding. In the blink of an eye, every door and wall was being desperately pounded by what must have been dozens of people, and all sorts of screams and wailings were coming from inside. My partner and I bolted straight to the car, but midway, my hero complex kicked in, completely idiotic. I headed straight back to one of the window openings. As I approached again, the screams got louder. The heat it being almost unbearable. I could feel my eyelashes getting singed. As soon as I got close enough, I looked inside, expecting to find something that could be making and responsible for all the noise. The building was empty. Just a rundown warehouse with their floors covered in blackened rubble. I got a really bad feeling in the pit of my stomach, so I bolted out without even looking back. I got inside the car, where my partner was very patiently waiting for me. We drove away very quickly. As we got out, and my heartbeat finally slowed, those voices, they still resonated in my head. They were screaming in pain, pleading for help. Of course, nobody took us seriously at all back at the station. Even the fire department got incredibly annoyed when they found nothing. They were sure somebody was playing a prank, and they were not fans of pranks, especially when it involved them wasting their time. But from then on, I was very weary of night patrols, even more so when they involved desolated places, old, dilapidated buildings, where gangs and criminals would go to hang out. After this, I never came across something like that afterwards. To be fair, I have not been to that part of the city ever since that night. I have done some research though, and turns out, around 50 years ago, the place was actually a textile factory that burned to the ground in a very uncontrollable fire. A massive conflagration. A lot of people, unfortunately, did not make it out. The factory was then rebuilt from the ground up, not too long after. I'm sorry I don't know the dates. I believe the screams we had heard were from the ghosts that were left behind. Scars left by the tragic events. I still don't know if that's really what it was, but whatever it was terrified me and makes me feel very sad about all of it. I've worked as an officer in Houston for a few years now, but this is one of the most terrifying experiences I've ever had. This occurred before I was married, and I was working the night shift often. Our police station is kind of small, but we have an honest, hardworking team of officers here. My partner's wife had been expecting at the time. He was there with me till about 10:30 p.m. Found out his wife's water had just broke and began experiencing contractions. So he opted out and got home to be with his wife. There was nobody else left at the station, which was okay, considering there wasn't a whole lot to do anyway. I had my patrol scheduled in an hour, around the block, but I had to finish some paperwork, making sure all my stuff was in order. I went outside, did my patrol, and finished. I didn't spot anything out of the ordinary. It was like that until I was walking back to the station, and the flickering lights caught my attention. The police station has a backup, always active, so that much flickering in the entire building was just weird. But that wasn't the weirdest thing. It was actually a small boy, around 10 years of age, standing with a teddy bear in his hand, facing the building with his back to me. I immediately began looking around. Who would leave a 10-year-old boy here at 1:25 a.m. outside of a police station? My instincts kicked in, and thoughts began swarming my mind. Was he abandoned by parents struggling financially, or mentally? Maybe he was injured. I called out to him, and I started running up to him. He turned around, and just then, the lights began to stop flickering. The boy had brown hair and sparkling eyes. I bent down on my knee and lightly grabbed his shoulders as I appeared to stay calm and inspect him from his head down to his toe, searching for any signs anywhere that he was hurt, as I asked for his name. He explained to me that his name was Tom. When I asked if he was hurt, he shook his head softly. I scanned the area quickly again, but no signs of anybody there. I patted Tom's head, told him to come inside with me. I kept a secret stash of chocolates with me in one of my drawers. I have a bit of a sweet tooth. I opened it up and gave one to the boy. I asked him how he ended up here at the station. He was breathing rapidly and sweating a lot. It was very concerning. He kept on looking at the sides as if he was expecting someone or something to jump right at him. He heaved a sigh and then motioned for me to come closer, as if he wanted to whisper something. He was a kid, so I thought sure, why not? He began to whisper while looking down at his teddy bear in his lap. He told me that he had 3 friends he used to play with him. He called them Ruth, Drew, and Calvin. I was taking notes as he was telling me. Tom said they got into a fight earlier today about something he was not aware of. During the argument, Ruth, Drew, and Calvin began to get violent with each other, ended up hurting Tom's mom just a while ago. Calvin disappeared soon afterwards and said that he would come after Tom and whoever he'd call for help. Ruth and Drew helped Tom get to the police station to get help for his mother. As you'd expect, it was clearly a child's tale with no realistic element, but still, I tried to go on from what he had told me. I had asked him to describe how his friends looked like, Calvin especially. Tom said that he couldn't do that. Even if he described it to me, adults could not see them. That was the point when I was sure the kid was just playing around, and it was just his own invisible friends he was talking about. I put down my pen, asking the boy where his mom was. Tom started to cry and said he already told me she needs help, and I was not listening to him. I asked him how I could help his mother. He said he'd show me the way to his home. I thought, what the heck, that's a good thing. I'd help the boy get back home. So I ruffled Tom's head, told him to lead the way. He grabs my hand, and both of us began to walk fast, with Tom leading me. We took a few turns and went on the 48th Street, when Tom ran inside a house and told me to hurry up. Drew said his mom didn't have that much time left. I didn't know what to do at that time, but I thought there was no harm in just checking out the house. I thought I could talk to his mother and tell her about his late-night adventures, and she definitely needs to put a stop to it. As soon as I stepped in the house, I immediately recognized the irony smell of fresh blood. I take out my weapon, get in stance, being ready to fire. I announced myself, and that whoever was in there should get out with their hands above their head. But there was nobody. I heard Tom calling me again from the distance. I rushed to him, found him bent over a woman's body in a pool of her own blood. Tom wasn't crying, but he was looking at me, pleading with his eyes to help him. I radioed it in right at that moment and checked her pulse. She was still alive, but barely. I called 911 too, and within a few moments, the woman was on a stretcher, on her way to the hospital. When backup was there, we searched the house and nearby area, but nothing suspicious. No signs of a forced entry, no signs of fight or struggle or anything. The woman had a cut on the back of her head, as if she had fallen and hit her head against a shelf or something. Still, no shelf could have given that sharp and deep of a cut. We never found out what happened, really. The woman recovered. She said she didn't remember anything, really. Tom stayed to his earlier count, which wasn't really helpful, but very creepy. I'm an officer here in the Philippines. I would like to share with you my very own story. I'm stationed in a small town in the island of Mindanao. It was a small town with very few residences. It was a quiet and peaceful place. Only a few cases of criminal activity are even reported monthly. On the night of November 1st, 2005, we received a rather peculiar case. It was about a sighting of some unknown entity near a local cemetery. Usually, the cases that we get are robberies, street fights, and once a month, we'll get a murder. But once in a blue moon, we'll get a case about something supernatural. Now, before the prior sighting of the unknown entity, 7 children between the ages of 5 and 9 have now been reported missing in the past few weeks. It was a case we have no leads on, nor any clues, except that they mysteriously disappeared near said place, near the cemetery. They were part of the families that lived near the cemetery. In the Philippines, kidnappers are notorious in some places. They would take children who look healthy and would sell their organs, and maybe child traffickers. The timing was also in line with All Souls Day. We Filipinos are superstitious people, so the town people were quite alarmed about the incident. The entity that was linked to the missing children, and as soon as the word got out, many believed the culprit was none other than this mysterious entity in question. Many experts in terms of the supernatural claims that the entity was eating the young souls of children. Many people swarmed the precinct, requested a very active investigation. I was one of the dispatch police assigned to investigate said case, just to show that we listen to the people, and also maybe we'll find a clue of this time who's behind it, the real culprit behind the missing child. Personally, I don't believe in all of that. While I do have a strong faith in God, and I'm a Christian, that's it. Anyway, it was now the next morning, November 2nd, 2005, and the two of us were sent to investigate the scene. When we got there, people are surrounded by the tree beside the cemetery. It was the same entity we had been seeing nearby. By the way, the witnesses claimed that the entity was a maligno, or a malevolent spirit. These spirits live in mounds, rocks, or trees. They described this spirit having long, slender spider arms, a big hairy body, one eye, no mouth and ears, and a long tail. They claimed to try to drag a child inside the cemetery at night, the night of November 1st. This is the spot where it happened, and people are scarce. We already tried to talk to the child, but the parents won't let us say they are adamant on keeping their children inside. This is why they surrounded it with salt, and anyone beside a family member was simply not allowed to enter. We had gone to the place where it happened. After looking around, we couldn't find any clues. We stayed and surveyed the area. We went back at noon, after finding nothing. Then, when 7 p.m. struck, we received yet another call that the entity showed up once again. So, me and the other officers went there and found people panicking. It was All Souls Day, so people were visiting the grave of a family. During the incident, people were pushing each other, causing injuries. We got to the site where the entity was seen, and there were people pointing towards an old tree. They're saying that it appeared near, but then disappeared immediately. We firmly took control of the situation, made people clear out of the area. The town officials also showed up, and were notified. They helped people calm down. Me and other officers split up to try and find clues. Perhaps this could just be a prank. I went towards a less populated area, or a place where less gravestones were. It could be where the culprit would run to, I thought. I was carefully advancing when, all of a sudden, I saw a shadow in my peripheral vision in my left eye. Immediately, I turned towards it, but there's nothing, and I felt something tugging my leg before falling forward. I was caught off guard and easily losing my balance. I hit the ground hard. I was able to use my hands to stop myself before my face hit the ground. I was about to stand when I was dragged by my left foot quite hard. I could feel my feet being clasped by something big and rough. I could feel the texture beneath the cloth, and it hurt so much at the moment. My heart was racing, and my thoughts were jumbled. I couldn't explain it, but at that moment, it felt like I was in a sleep paralysis. I felt so much negative energy, I couldn't move. I knew this wasn't normal. I was aware of my surroundings, but it felt like something heavy was on my chest. At the time, I knew I had simply encountered the maligno. I felt like I was dragged for a long time when suddenly I woke up and found myself lying on the ground. I was unresponsive towards whatever happened prior, just staring blankly at the sky. I still remember that I have no thoughts at the moment. I tried to stand, but found myself unable to. My left foot was bruised and swollen. Again, at the time, I knew it hurt. I could feel it hurting, but my mind was unresponsive. After not being able to stand, I sat on the ground like I was mindless. It didn't take long before I felt normal again. I didn't know how long I was sitting there. I don't remember. After the feeling of being aware came back, I called for backup while looking around, panicking and praying out loud. After a while, my colleague arrived, but I still didn't feel secure. I wanted to get out of there. Years already passed, and I still remember that one night very vividly. I was so helpless, I couldn't even look at the maligno. I thought to myself, always, maybe that's what the children felt, that there were no sign of a struggle. I can't express or explain how scary the experience was. I told my story to others already, and some believe, while others did not. The missing children were not found. No culprit was apprehended. Also, all the trees in and near the cemetery were cut down. No children went missing again. I've never believed in God. It was all too convenient for my liking. The songs and the stories were all wrapped up in putrid desperation that made it hard to believe a word of it. Who would ever come up with such an idea as a divine being that cared equally for 7 billion, not excluding those long dead and waiting to be born, of his children, was doing nothing more than shouting into the void or begging for therapy? At least, it sounded that way to me. What other explanation was there when children were starving or being locked in cages for daring to cross a man-made line of no crossies? How was I supposed to believe that famine and diseases were trials brought to pass by a benevolent being, while people bombed and gassed and starved and enslaved in the past? When children woke up, not knowing if they'd be shot dead for pursuing an education in the now. The pain and suffering that came with simply being alive. It did not seem like the work of a benevolent leader of any sort. Honestly, it appeared like tyranny, child abuse even, and I personally never subscribed to it because of that. While not believing in that also came the belief of not believing in ghosts, not believing in an afterlife of any sort, and being absolutely tickled pink by the idea of inherently nasty, chronically evil beings, demons. If I could not believe in the absolute good, that old woman ensured me existed in a God nobody had ever seen. I wasn't sure why they thought they could convince me of the absolute evil that was, supposedly, too heinous to comprehend, but also no match for the goodness that was comprehensible. It did not make a lick of sense, and so, as a result, I left the church before my voice finished deepening and invested my time and effort into something that could, I feel, make a difference. I donated my time and my money in an attempt to help the helpless, instead of waiting for some fabled, generous deity to help them in my stead. And, when I was old enough, I joined the police academy in an attempt to actually make a difference. Sure, I smoked, I drank, I indulged in women and men. But when bad things came, I was the first guy people called out to for help. I like to think that if a God does exist, he's simply been playing hooky these past few 100,000 million years. Anyway, me being too nice is pretty much how I got myself into this mess. I was working the night shift on Saturday, Randy's Saturday night shift. And just so we're clear, I was never meant to suffer this way. Because of my worsening eyesight, I was pretty much removed from the nighttime rotation in an effort to avoid having a half-blind cop having to chase some speeding dipwit down a half-lit Kentucky highway. If not for the fact that Randy's wife had suddenly gone into labor, I never had had my faith shaken. You see, it was halfway through my shift. My eyes felt like they were full of sand at this point. My partner, whom I'll call Vanessa, suggested we stop for a coffee, calling me 100 variations of old all the while. But before we had the chance to pull into the only open establishment within a 6-mile radius, McDonald's, of course. The radio began kicking up status and a report of domestic abuse. Apparently, neighbors were having a barbecue, and they had heard the woman that lived in the house to the left screaming bloody murder. When they'd gone over to check on the woman that lived there at the house, things had gone silent, and they'd been left standing at the door, talking to nobody at all. We pulled into the neighborhood in record time, leaving the car with our hands already hovering at our belts. The door easily gave beneath our combined force. When the sound ceased its echoing, I led the way into the house, darn near holding my breath as I tried not to make a sound of anything. I'd been in graveyards with more life and stillness, and it also made me nervous. Civilians had not reported gunshots or slamming, unless he strangled her. There was no sign he'd killed her at all. What made me most nervous, though, was the dust that coated the counters and furniture. It was so thick, I could draw it in. There was no evidence that anybody at all had been there in months, which meant that we'd either been set up for the neighbors, who were delusional. Vanessa and I combed the house from top to bottom, searching very carefully for signs of struggle, and when we found nothing, we headed back to the front. Our shift was nearly over at this point. We did not have the energy to press for details. A door swinging open to my left gave me a moment's pause. We'd been so sure to close each door behind ourselves, as it was the first thing we learned in police academy. To always be hyper-aware of your surroundings and alert. You never know when things may turn awry. I was quick to chalk it up to something loose in the hinges. Vanessa shuddered and went for the rosary she kept in her front breast pocket. She held it so tightly, it was nearly convincing. Almost. Maybe the snorting was unnecessary. Maybe. Perhaps if I hadn't chosen to be such a pig about being an atheist, that thing wouldn't have wasted its time. But I was. So it did. A whisper that ran cold down my back seemed to lock up my ear with 4 words that made my entire body run cold. You're going to hell. I don't know who was faster on their way down the stairs, me or Vanessa, but at some point, I was dragging her after me and into the open air. We turned to search for the neighbors we'd left outside, only to find the entire street was now dark. There was no sign that anybody had ever been there at all. Vanessa took that information in, heading for the car, telling me to come up with an explanation for that. And honestly, to this day, I don't have one. I feel a little more open-minded after this event, and maybe, as time goes on, I'll come to know the real truth. Perhaps my judgment of things in life is not all that accurate, given this new experience. A girl had come to our police station to report that somebody was stalking her in her newer apartment. We initially preceded the case as simple, but it was not what it looked like. She had moved into her apartment only 2 weeks prior. It happened when she was actually looking for a new apartment to rent into. When she surfed online to find one, there was this one place, ready to move in, but the price was lesser compared to the area where it was situated. It seemed very strange considering the area was very active, and all the other places around were much more higher in rent. Although looking at pictures, she could not tell that from what she was seeing. She contacted the number given below the advertisement. The person on the other side was a broker. She had visited the building 2 days after said phone call. According to the statements given by her, after the call, she used to get blank calls late at night. Every night, early morning, 2 to 3 a.m. This continued on for 2 days. When she visited the building, everything looked quite okay, but when she reached the 3rd floor and walked to the apartment, she was waiting for the broker to open it. She saw some people waiting outside. They began to discuss something. She found this very unsettling. It was a 1-bedroom, 1 kitchen, 1 bath, with a tiny little balcony apartment. She noticed some trash and dirt, but Other than that, it was fine. The trash and dirt she had mentioned were in the hallway leading into the apartment, not actually inside. A month later, she decided to move into it, and 15 days after that, she moved in. The movers who were helping her were saying that the apartment had felt cold and uneasy. The same night when she was done with her shift, she had come back to her new apartment and claimed that there was shadows moving around. There was this unnatural darkness resting in the corridor of her apartment. The next day, when she stepped out of her apartment building in the morning, there was also a package with her name on it. She put it inside, went ahead to the office. Later on, when she went down to the building and came back, she had gazed up at her balcony, having the feeling like somebody was watching her, standing up there. As she ran up to her apartment, she felt like somebody was around. She got there and the door was slightly open. She reached into her bag quickly to pull out the pepper spray. However, upon searching the entire apartment, nobody was there. The night when she came back home, she had ordered some food out because her kitchen was still a disorganized mess. Her doorbell rang, so she stood up, walked towards the door, and before opening it, peeked out through the peek hole and saw a man standing out there whom she did not recognize. He was in all black, and his face was somewhat concealed. When she asked if it was the delivery, she got no response. This scared her. He kept ringing the bell and then pounding on the door. She did not open the door but stood behind the wall with a large baseball bat in her hand. After a few minutes of this man knocking and the doorbell, it eventually stopped. After waiting a couple of minutes for things to stay quiet, she again peeked through the hole, and he was now gone. Her phone had kept ringing all night. It was from a private number. She feared picking up the call would be one of those scary episodes, where the man was just breathing into the phone, but she refused to pick it up. She immediately turned her phone off, and all the lights of her apartment. She could see the corridor lights were moving, as if somebody was pacing up and down the hallway. The doorbell kept ringing again, and she assumed it was the same creep from earlier. She looked through the hole, but this time, it was actually the delivery person. She was so scared, she just gave him the money through the closed door, passing it underneath, and told him to leave the bag there, and thanked her. She opened the door, and there was nobody. She picked up her food and brought it inside. The night then went by again. However, after that night, things kept happening. Like one time, all her plants in her balcony were smashed out of nowhere. The flickering lights, someone knocking in her door at all hours of the night, pounding on the door, ringing the doorbell, the feeling of being watched and followed wherever she went. She often claimed she did not feel alone in that apartment, that there was a very uneasy presence. After hearing all of that firsthand, we checked on all the CCTV cameras around the area, specifically around her apartment building. Even going back to the exact day and time she claimed that this happened. While we saw her peeking out of her door multiple times on camera, we saw nobody in the hallways, nobody standing by her door. We did see the delivery man stop by and take the money from underneath the door, dropping off her food and walking away. But no other person, not the way she described. We managed to talk to DoorDash and the delivery person who worked for them about that night. He told us a very different story. He informed us that he had kept knocking for about 10 minutes, but nobody answered, which I have to say is quite a feat for anybody working for a small online food delivering service, that you'd stay there for 10 minutes knocking a door and not just dropping off the food. That was suspicious already. But he claims that a woman finally opened the door and took the food, since it was already paid for online. She never paid him in cash. If the woman is saying she paid in cash beneath the door, then who is the person delivering the food? We showed him her photo, but he denied saying that she was not the woman who ordered the food. And in fact, we showed him the footage. The delivery person wasn't even him. We also showed the delivery person's photo to a woman she accepted saying it was him. She recognized him right away, but he did not recognize her. Besides, he testified he never saw her. We decided to give a visit to her apartment once more. Everything looked ordinary, but the apartment again was unusually cold. There felt an uneasy feeling when you'd walk in. When asked about it, the woman answered that there's a draft coming through the apartment, that she cannot figure out where it's coming from. All the seals of the doors and windows were functioning as intended, but the draft seemed to be coming from the balcony. Once inspected, nothing was ultimately found. We did hear strange tapping in the walls, but nothing that couldn't be pinpointed to probably mice or rats. All other CCTV footages were okay. No culprit was found. We asked her to call the station again if she ever found herself in a similar situation. We did not hear from her for about 2 more weeks, so we had visited her apartment. It was locked. We asked the family living beside the apartment about the woman who had lived there. They both gave each other strange looks. We asked them to tell anything they know. They kind of hesitated, but after much discussion, they told us something very weird. They claimed that about 5 years ago, a girl used to live there alone, and one night, her ex-boyfriend had entered the apartment through the balcony, physically assaulting her and leaving her there. After 2 weeks, when the apartment started smelling foul, they informed the upper heads, and they checked. They found her dead. Police caught the man and he was sentenced to prison. A beautiful young lady had come to rent that same apartment only a few weeks later. She got in and never saw them again. This same incident had occurred several times after. Multiple women, actually, all moving into that apartment, months and months at a time, and disappearing. After checking details about previous owners, the owner before this woman was a woman in her 40s. When we put all the photos in front of the delivery person, he picked up the photo of the woman in her 40s. However, according to everybody in that building, this woman disappeared weeks after she had moved in. That now was months ago. And according to an elderly lady who lived across this mysterious apartment, this apartment sends the residents to a different dimension, where they keep on living their life, but we've taken what she said as a grain of salt. Everybody can have their own crazy theories. Either way, as just something personal and not professional, I will say this. There's definitely a crazy, creepy feeling when entering that apartment. There's something going on. Growing up, I always wanted to be like my father, brave and courageous, always fighting against wrong and instilling good, or trying to. He was a police officer, and from a very tender early age, I decided that was the path I was going to continue on to. Carrying a real weapon everywhere. You know, the fantasy of beating up bad guys and robbers. Maybe it wasn't my father who had influenced me to be an officer. Maybe it was more the action movies we used to watch, like Die Hard and things like that. Anyways, fast forward, and I'm 22 years old. A newly appointed rookie officer, patrol duty near Emily Bridge in Vermont. It was a very popular tourist attraction, but not because of its beauty, because of the creepy urban legend surrounding it. This 50-foot-long bridge is said to be the site of a young woman's suicide in the mid-1800s. According to legend, the woman, Emily, was supposed to meet her lover at the bridge to elope. However, she ended up hanging herself from the rafters when he never showed. Now, it's believed that Emily's ghost scratches at cars, crosses pedestrians, and sometimes just appears in front of them in her ghastly, evil form. I don't believe in such superstitions and legends. People have committed suicide in many places. How come the whole world is not haunted with their spirits? So, it was a Saturday morning, the time of my duty, right near the bridge. I was patrolling alongside my partner, a 39-year-old officer whose name I will not mention. 20 years of experience and a lot of stories on how he saved the world, apparently. He's so talkative, my head ached from listening to him over and over. I tried drowning him off by playing Grease 2 in my head, and eating my roll, which I had bought. Street food during patrolling is the best. My partner also had a roll, but God forbid he quietly eat and stop talking. He's narcissistic and so self-obsessed. He even talks with his mouth full. During one of his abnormally long stories about how he had apparently saved a woman from being kidnapped, we heard a shrill scream. It seemed that a woman was screaming, but what most shook me was the pure terror that could be heard in her voice. We quickly geared up, walked toward the sound of the scream, which was apparently under the Emily Bridge. As soon as we reached there, I saw a sight which I'll probably won't ever be able to forget. A man lying on the ground, moaning in pain as his back bled, and a pool of blood was forming underneath him, while a woman was being strangled by a white shimmery thing. When my partner and I both stopped, the white thing stopped strangling that woman and turned around. It was a ghost. The ghost of a woman. Probably Emily from the legend. It stopped and disappeared. It gave us this creepy cackle, and quickly disappearing. We stood shaken for a moment, because what on earth? But then went towards the distressed couple, lying traumatized. I checked if the man was lying on the ground, while my partner checked on the quietly sobbing woman. Thankfully, the woman was not hurt, so I called my partner to help me pick up the man and quickly get away from under the bridge, lest that Emily ghost comes again. How would this be able to happen? Even guns wouldn't affect a ghost. After coming away from the bridge, I laid the guy in the back seat of my car and took out my first aid kit, while my partner phoned an ambulance. The woman, poor her, she was traumatized, asking if her boyfriend would be all right. He was bleeding badly. My partner tried to console her, but she just could not stop sobbing. It was a terrifying thing being attacked. I wouldn't blame her so much for crying. I would have done it too. We tried asking her what happened, but she couldn't speak so much to tell what happened. When the ambulance arrived, we put the couple in it and sent them on their way to the hospital. We basically told our story to our supervisor. He laughed in our face and didn't believe me. Even my experienced partner at first, but we luckily had our cameras on us and had recorded the entire thing. Although the ghost of Emily was invisible in the recording, which is creepy, we could see the bleeding man and the being just flying in the air while clutching her neck where the hands of the ghost had been. Our supervisor was very quiet, asked us to do a follow-up with the couple, and asked them about what happened there to make sure their stories added up. We waited till the next day before checking up on them. You obviously need some time to accept what happened and come out of that traumatized state. The next morning, we left for the hospital where the couple was currently in. We asked them how they had been and if they were feeling better. They were better physically, but emotionally, they were still dealing with the repercussions of what happened. Upon asking what happened under the bridge, the woman told us that they were just making out when this being appeared. This white apparition formed around her boyfriend and tried to throw him off the bridge. He fought her back when she proceeded to attack, preventing him and her from leaving. I don't know. When the woman tried to save her boyfriend by trying to drag him away and throw him off the bridge, this thing began choking this girl. It's completely wacko, right? While this thing was choking her is when we had appeared. She profusely thanked us for saving their lives, suggested that we should close the underside of the bridge. Safe to say, I did not expect this to happen when I applied for working as an officer. I understand this probably sounds like some cheesy, creepy story, but I promise, things happen on the job that are far more unquestionable and disturbing, to say the least. And stories like this get concealed from the public far more often than you would ever imagine. I was doing my night shift, around 4 or so in the morning. It was calm, nothing out of the ordinary. The most extreme things I'd see would be burglars and thieves, and sometimes we'd even have to break a fight between teenagers. So, I was inside my patrol vehicle, and suddenly began seeing a weird shadow. I'll describe it to you the best I can. It was tall, its arms and legs abnormally long, but shadows just get distorted. It's a game of lights, and the street lamps will make things look odd, especially at this time of night. Everything was silent, too quiet, and perhaps I was distracted. I look at the source of the movement. Don't ask me why, but for some reason, I thought it was male. I just knew it. The truth was that I saw nothing. The corner of a building blocked my sight, and I could not see the source. So, I just moved the car towards it, only found an empty street. Mind you, I'm a 32-year-old female, and I've been a police officer for more than 10 years at this point. I can't be scared easily. I've seen it all, even less for the supposed supernatural. I believe in neither of those things, and to this day. The only horrors are those real people can do, not some ethereal entity moving to do God knows what to us. If anything, I've been told I'm too cold by people around me. The truth is that I'm not the most expressive person to be around, which sometimes just unnerves people. Well, this shadow keeps getting larger and larger. It was of human shape, if well, very deformed. It looked too tall to be a person. But then, lights often make us see weird stuff. Then, it began to get close, slowly. I could see how it moved its legs in the weird manner they got twisted as it walked. I began to look behind me and at the sides. I remember hearing a street dog whimpering and feeling this utter sense of dread. It was completely irrational, I know. The hairs at the back of my neck stood up, and this ugly chill ran down my spine. The dog in the distance kept whimpering. A sense of pity, I think. Something, it made me get out of the car, open the door, and get it inside. Oh man, the feeling of vulnerability I felt was horrible. I moved fast, tried to look better at my surroundings, but there was nothing to see. Even all my training did not allow me to see what was around me. The dog kept whimpering. I turned on the engine and noped out of there, out of that accursed street. The people at the station told me nothing about the dog. We kept it there until morning when I left, and animal control would take care of it. I kept it for 5 years, actually. I had to get it from animal control. It was female, and passed away of old age. I called her Hope. Man, nothing even supernatural happened to me again. But I still remember that night, and the ugly chill that ran down my spine. The shadow that I looked like reminded me of something you would see from Slender Man. You know, that whole creepypasta Gen Z thing. So far, I don't know if it was a paranormal encounter or not. I'd like to believe it wasn't. But I felt something was out there, getting close to me, and so did this dog. Either way, whatever you believe, it was certainly creepy. My dad worked as a cop in a small town here in Montana. Nothing really out of the ordinary. Just burglars and kids playing pranks. Domestic violence stuff. Yeah, that was ordinary for him. As my siblings and I grew older, we learned some pretty unnerving stuff about people and our neighbors. Some people are just evil. No justifications necessary. My father is a very no-nonsense kind of man. He's also an atheist and very skeptical about things like the paranormal, especially considering most of the crap he's had to deal with involved real-life humans or animals. But there is one situation he never got cleared up. There are lots of abandoned houses where we grew up. My town definitely saw better times in the past. There were some pretty elegant buildings left to decay. Kids would play there, urban exploration, and there were a few emergencies concerning drug dealers and gangs. Mostly calls from scared neighbors or people who saw weird stuff. One night, and my father is sent with a partner towards an abandoned place because a kid and an elderly woman saw a witch man dancing to a fire in the backyard, apparently. He thought it was either a druggie or some sort of gang activity. It had to go. The worst is that they can only find it would be local kids lighting up a bonfire, and they'd have to stop them and make them douse out the fire before things got out of control. So, they met a bunch of neighbors complaining about the noise and lights, and everybody kept talking about the witch man. My father's companion says he saw somebody moving on the floor above, so they got to the house, announced themselves, and just get inside because, naturally, nobody answered. Once inside, they say the prank was successful and fun, but that it's time to stop. The neighbors have had enough. They start to register the place, room from room, and they only see old stuff, but really nothing of value. It must have been stolen. Same for the second floor. But there, my father begins feeling tense, and so does his partner. Like they were being watched. But they saw nobody. And it's not like there were many places left to hide, really. In the end, both my father and his partner saw something shiny outside. Orange light of fire. But when they looked at the window, they saw nobody there. They talked to the police station via the radio, hearing more complaints about the noise, but nothing else. Both walked around the garden and saw nothing. That's what they told the worried neighbors. It was not until they reached the station that they saw the people they were giving them odd looks. A lady from admin later showed them an audio recording. In it, you could hear my father and his colleague describing what he saw and the neighbors' complaints. Yelling noises in the background from an angry man with a very deep, raspy voice. The noises were slushed and weird, but it said something like, "Get out. This is my place." They received a few more emergency calls. Nobody ever found anything really relevant. To this day, my father, who, I repeat, is still a firm non-believer, still feels rather creeped out when he remembers on that event. I've been a police officer now for 30 years. It has its times of being a challenging job, but as any other, you'd expect it to be hard. But it's always something I feel I can handle. Only one time did I ever think about quitting, and that's when something impossible had happened to me. My mind and my common sense have always kept me sane, even through any possible situation in life. I'm a reasonable individual. I never believed in ghosts or the supernatural. I firmly believe people who make these stories up, believe in them, are truly insane. I'm also an atheist for the most part, and have been for most of my life. After the events I'm about to tell you about, I really changed my belief in God. I'm now 100% sure God exists, or at least some form of higher power that's out there, controlling everything behind the scenes. Let me tell you my story. One day, I was working the shift in the office. I was called out to check upon a house. Some people passing by claimed they saw something inside. They were concerned about a few squatters causing trouble. Everybody knows the house I was supposed to check on had been abandoned for at least over 10 years. It's in a small area, on top of a smaller hill. It's only about a 20-minute drive from the last house in the street. Sounds creepy, but it's not one of those. It just never got finished, and it's often been a problem area for squatters. There have been numerous drug deals there too, that we've had to deal with. It's got very modern-style architecture, and it's quite ahead of its time, honestly. It's got a long road leading up to it, and a very large, unkempt front yard. I will never understand why they built the house exactly in that place, and why they left it to just fall apart. I think it was something like the owner had committed suicide or something. I don't remember. One more thing that I always wonder is why the house was never vandalized. Yeah, we've had drug problems there and drug deals and even some minor gang activity. And of course squatters, but never teenagers breaking in and spray painting stuff. I don't know. But after being there several times in the past, that whole property has a very weird vibe to it, like an unwelcoming vibe. So, when I got called out there, I knew that I wouldn't see anybody there. The kids were probably just drunk or under the influence of a horror movie they had just seen, imagining seeing somebody in the house, or they really were seeing squatters. It was my job to go check it out and report if anything was truly out of order. While I was approaching the front yard of the house, I had that strange feeling again. Something was going to happen. That gut feeling telling me I should turn around and lie about even going to the house. I brushed it off though. Nothing was going to happen, obviously. Coming closer and closer to the house, I realized just how quiet it was, eerily quiet, and how nice the house was still, on the outside. I got out of my vehicle and began to scout around, seeing if there were any signs of squatters or people breaking in. I saw nothing. Everything looked fine to me. I began to turn around and start to head back, but noticed the front door was wide open. Something I had not noticed right away when I pulled up, because I was so busy looking around the sides of the house. I walked up the long driveway, up to the steps. The house had a very smelly, musty odor. The hallway was empty, and all I could hear was my own breathing. I went into the room on the first left. It was the kitchen, also empty. It took a few minutes to check the entire house, and there was nobody inside, just as I had suspected. I began to make my way downstairs to try and lock the door. It was opened by the wind or something. Going down the stairs, I saw a woman standing in the middle of the hallway, staring at me. She was dressed in all black and looked very sick. I asked her what was wrong and how she got there. I didn't hear anybody else come up or pull up in front of the house, and as I mentioned, I checked it entirely just a few minutes earlier. The woman did not answer my question, or any other question that I had, like who she was, what she was doing in the house, and if she realized what she was doing was actually trespassing. She did not answer any of those questions. I began to walk towards her. I told her to put her hands up above her head. I was going to take her to the station to question her, but as I said, she began running at me. Her face twisted, and I jumped when I saw it. There was this disturbing madness resting in her eyes, like she was going to attack me. I didn't know what she would do if she did, so I fired a shot in her chest, and she stopped, looking at me in that exact moment, and the madness had just disappeared. She just looked sad and abandoned. She fell to the ground. I could not let her die. I called an ambulance and ran to her. The only word she said to me that night was why. I didn't know what to tell her. She closed her eyes and I felt her pulse fade away. She was dead. I couldn't handle the fact that I had to kill her. At least until the ambulance got there, I sat by her body, trying to process it all. After two of the most agonizing moments in my life, she began breathing again. I don't know what I had to do to get my conscience clear. A few days later, they called me in from the hospital. She had wanted to talk to me. She told me something that made me believe she was on the other side, dead, and she was okay. Just about to go into the light, when a man had stopped her and told her she shouldn't do that. She should go back. So she did. That's why she's alive. Except she doesn't exist. There is no record of this person being alive or being born, nor does she remember who she is, where she came from, or what she was doing inside that house that day. And yet, oddly and disturbingly, she knows very personal details about my life, and said that me being called there that night was by fate and destiny. She knows things about my family, my childhood, things only me and my family could ever know about. And yet, after being subjected to a polygraph test, she truthfully and honestly has no recollection of her own identity, or her past, but somehow claims that she knows everything about me, who I am, and how we were meant to be reunited. I feel like life has truly thrown me a wild card, and I really would help if I can get some closure from your opinions. To give you some context before telling you my story, I used to work as a police officer. I'm from France, so that's where all of this takes place. I quit the job about 5 years ago. My mother's health was declining fast at the time, and I needed more time to take care of her. My mother passed away, not even a year after that, but I've not returned to the job to this day. I don't plan on going back at all, partly because of the weird things I'm about to tell you about. I was out one night, and the person I was with, well, we were not the best of friends. I felt like he was too aggressive and rude with people. Not the type of person you want to have a power over others. I'm basically saying that he was a prick who thought he was better than everybody, and everybody made sure to abuse his position of power whenever he could. Nobody really liked working with him. He was every bad picture you could want to paint. Sexist, racist, very homophobic, and a narcissist. Imagine how he acted around me. I knew that he despised me. It called my life choices disgusting multiple times. This might sound really strange, but I feel like everything he said was questionable or downright awful. Sometimes it was his glass falling off the table and breaking. Sometimes it was his car alarm going off. And sometimes there were random noises around him, like random screaming. This one time, we had heard random shots next to us when we were investigating a robbery, and he couldn't help but say some horrible stuff about the black woman and her child living there. I really don't know how to explain it. It's like something was following him around and bullying him. He completely ignored it though, pretended like we were just imagining things. There was no way he didn't see it. It wasn't karma. It was something bad, like an entity. I knew that it made all of us feel uncomfortable and kind of scared in some way. It was freaky. And that one night I was working with him was the most confusing night of my life. He was exceptionally grumpy that evening and made sure to show me throughout our entire shift. He kept on complaining about his family, his neighbors, and our colleagues and gossiping to my face. I tried my best to ignore him, but it began getting out of hand. He was really starting to piss me off. Throughout the night, there were several small incidents that happened. Some small and not too worrisome, but some were really scaring me. The first thing that happened in the car was the radio all of a sudden turning up in static. He turned it down and continued driving, as if he didn't think it was weird. After a little while, during one of his obnoxious rants, his coffee cup flew out of the cup holder towards him. This one scared me. It obviously couldn't have fallen out of the cup holder. It was basically launched at him. Again, he didn't seem to care at all, and continued talking. After that, it was quiet for a while. Not that many people were out and about on the streets, so the shift was more calm. Everything turned around after that, though. It just got way worse. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something running from the side of the road, right in front of our car. We hit the brakes, and before he could come to a stop, you could feel that we had hit it. What I saw looked like a black cat, so I just assumed we had killed it. I was surprised by him braking. I didn't think he's the type of person to care about that. You'd almost expect him to drive faster for something like that. We both got out of the car to see what happened, but to our surprise, there was nothing. I was sure that we had hit an animal. We both did. And he was just as confused as I was, but said the animal had probably been able to get away from the vehicle, that maybe we had just hit something else. None of this made sense whatsoever. We got back into the car. We were both very quiet at this point. After a couple of minutes, I almost launched out of my seat. My partner hits the brakes out of the car out of nowhere. We come to a stop and I asked him what had happened. Now he looked scared. I had not seen him act like this ever, so it worried me. He told me that whilst we were driving, he sees a light behind the car, so he looks into the rearview mirror, and what he had seen terrified him. In the back seat of the car, according to him, was a woman, dressed in all black. She stared right at him, with a straight face. He said he immediately pushed the brakes, and when he looked back up, she was gone. I could tell that he was not okay at all. As soon as he told me this, I saw somebody standing to the other side of the road from the corner of my eye. I soon turned around to look from there. They were then gone. I cannot tell you how uncomfortable I felt. Seeing him being equally as freaked out as I was made it worse. He had ignored everything up until this point, but could not ignore what we had seen that night. We didn't talk about it after. You'd expect something like that to change a person. And after a couple of days of him being more quiet, he went back to his old ways. I've been an officer in our small town since, well, before I can even remember. But I have never experienced something quite similar to what I did last week. I don't believe in the paranormal or anything of that kind. I never have. But the logic I have been raised to apply cannot begin to explain this. I have never quite seen something as strange. I'm not sure if anybody else has either. You see, there is no rational way to try and explain it or even make it sound plausible. But please, bear with me. I need to tell you the story that changed my perspective on my life. At around 8 p.m., we had gotten word from dispatch about a dispute taking place between some college kids. Apparently, it had begun as a minor disturbance and soon turned into a full-fledged physical fight. The scene was a good 1-hour drive, even if we drove like NASCAR racers. It was taking place at the literal border of our area of jurisdiction, so I was sure that we were going to be plenty late to the party. No other units were available at the time either, except for us, so we got moving. This is precisely why cops get a bad rep for always being late, you know. The units nearby are always busy with something for some reason. Gene, my colleague, and I drove as I sat in a seat beside him, looking out the window and listening to my growling stomach. I hadn't eaten lunch that day due to work, and I'm not somebody who can go a long time without eating. At around 8:30, still a rather large distance away from our destination, we stopped at a drive-through sandwich place that had come our way. We were going to be late anyway, so stopping for a few moments couldn't possibly hurt. I would not have been surprised if the fight was already over by now, and everybody had just gone home, or to the hospital, or whatever. I unwrapped my sandwich as Gene resumed the drive. He only had bought an iced coffee, despite me telling him to grab something to eat while he had the chance. He had been with me and had not had lunch yet either. My guess was he was not hungry. Anyway, there we were once again, driving through the empty road in silence. The road had thick trees on either side of it, and completely void of people. It was pretty peacefully, actually, minus what had followed. At around 8:50, I noticed something weird, out of the ordinary. The road had been straight all this while, but somehow we passed the sandwich shop that we had bought our stuff from once again. I pointed this out to Gene, who stopped and checked. Yes, we had been driving straight on a straight road for the last 20 minutes, and somehow traveled in a circle. It was that very same sandwich shop. I told him to put it on his GPS, if he doesn't know the way. He reluctantly did, swearing that he had been on this road multiple times, and confidently knew the way. Once again, we left the shop behind us and continued the journey. I was rather observant of the outside this time, so when the long road lined with trees opened up to reveal the same shop, I couldn't believe my eyes. Gene had noticed it too, and pulled over. He checked his GPS. Sure enough, we were again back at the same place. I couldn't understand it. even I had driven on this road before, and it was not, and I promise, a circular path in any way. Something wasn't right. As he mumbled in confusion, I explained to him, "Please, let me drive." Now, it was 9:10 p.m. already, and he then repeatedly coming back to the same spot. This was not helping us. Looking carefully at the GPS on his phone in front of me, I began to drive, even though I paid as much attention to the road in front of me as I did to the GPS route, showing me a straight path to the destination. Somehow, we ended up by the shop yet again. I started freaking out. What is happening here? I looked at Jean, who was clearly as disturbed as I was. I couldn't just radio into dispatch and tell them we were going through some sort of time warp. They think we're high or on drugs or drunk. So, I had to think of something. I got out of the car and went to the owner of the shop. He was an older gentleman, in his later 60s. The same one actually who had given me the sandwich. I told him about the weird thing happening with us and asked if somebody else had experienced it before. He was rather hard of hearing, so I had to repeat myself and raise my voice quite a few times. When he finally understood what I was trying to say, he looked clueless and simply shook his head. I walked back disappointed. The conversation had not been fruitful in any way, and we drove off, yet again, swearing that if the road somehow led us to the shop once more, I'd finally radio for the backup we needed. Keep in mind that I was plenty creeped out at this point, and so was Jean. This time, however, the road lined with trees and went on for longer and did not lead us back to the same point. When I saw the connecting roads branching out from the one we were on, I felt a sigh of relief coming on, like I had never had before. Granted, we reached our scene by 9:50 p.m. and did not see a soul. But honestly, I didn't care. We had somehow been driving a circle on a straight road for over an hour, breaking out that there was more than enough time for me, as Jean spoke to dispatch. I set the location in the GPS for the station, rerouting it, so we didn't have to take the same path. No way in hell was I going to go through that again. As an officer, I have seen many weird things, but I have always been able to somewhat explain it with reason and logic, rational thinking. Strange animals, strange shapes, the paranormal, possessed people, people on drugs, gunfights, you name it. People are strange. However, something like this that feels like we were in the Twilight Zone. I don't know how to describe this. I have looked into this before, and the only thing that comes up is the Mandela effect, which might or might not be part of what I experienced. Either way, it's hard for me to even comprehend and acknowledge that it really happened. The GPS and my memory both are a testament to the linearity of the path we were on. Yet, we had somehow been looped over and over again. Talk about the Twilight Zone. Let me know what you think. I would love to hear your opinion on what you think happened. I'd wanted to be a police officer ever since I was just a little boy. I've dressed up for one every single Halloween that I can remember. There simply wasn't any other job that I ever had an interest in. This is probably due to the fact that my own father was a more well-known officer in the LAPD and my role model for everything in my life. As soon as I completed high school, I immediately tried to get enrolled in the police academy, got accepted, and began my training. Recently, I just celebrated 10 years since getting my gun and badge. I've loved every minute of the job, thanks to my father. I've met all kinds of twisted and dangerous deranged people, though, but I've never felt scared. Every encounter with them just made my desire to protect and serve stronger. That's why the only time I've ever actually felt fear was when I was confronted with something non-human. It's something I still can't explain today. It happened sometime in August. Me and my partner were in our car, and we got a call over the radio from an address not far from us. A man calling 911 claimed there was an intruder in his house. We rushed to the address as fast as possible and got to the front door. There was no sign of a forced entry, but the door was unlocked, so we very slowly went inside and began scouting the house. After a couple of minutes, there was only one room left that we did not clear, and the door was locked. We stated that we were the police, and the owner of the house opened the door, coming out of the bathroom with a knife in his hands. As soon as he saw us, he looked relieved and put down the weapon. He explained that he lives there alone, and he heard a door in the house open and close just before he fled, locking himself in the bathroom. There wasn't really much we could do to help. We looked around for any shoe prints or tracks or fingerprints, but nothing. There was no sign of anybody coming in. We advised him to lock the door and call us again if anything happened or if he saw anything. We were going to head back. That same night, the dispatcher got a call from the same address, and again, it was the same man, claiming somebody is inside the house, trying to break in the bathroom door. He truly sounded sincere and looked worried. This time, the front door was locked, and we had to break in. But after scouting the house again, we did not find anybody inside. Also, no signs of a forced entry either. When the man came out of the bathroom, he was pale and looked rather terrified. After we talked to him again, my partner and I went outside and discussed the situation in private. We were absolutely sure nobody else could have been in the house, but we also agreed he doesn't look like he is making things up, or crazy, or delusional. He was your average 40-year-old man. We concluded that he might be delusional, though, so we decided to go through his medical records to see if we can dig up anything in his past. Perhaps there was a possibility of mental illness. We did not learn anything that would support this idea, but we did find something very strange. This man in the past had reported his wife missing about a week earlier. Police still had not found her. I asked around a little bit. I could not find much. Something was off about all of it. I could not sleep that night, thinking about everything. We had checked multiple records, and after time, discovered that he didn't try to contact the police or anything about his wife since the day he had reported her missing. He was becoming more and more suspicious. So, one evening, I decided to stake out at his house to see if I can find out anything. I parked my personal vehicle nearby and waited. Around midnight, the police got a call again. It was from the same man, claiming somebody was inside. I've been outside his house now for the last couple of hours and was definitely sure nobody got in or out. A little bit after the call, I could see a silhouette walking around the house. I contacted dispatcher. He told them he was hiding in the bathroom. I was completely puzzled and clueless about what is happening, so I decided to go inside alone. Instead of waiting for backup, I was certain somebody was going to walk in the house. I picked the lock and slowly made my way inside, sneaking around. I could hear somebody banging on the door of the bathroom. When I got closer, nobody was there, and the only sound was the man crying in the bathroom. I managed to get him to come out and sat down to talk to him. I assured him that I believe that something is going on, confronting him about his missing wife. As soon as I mentioned her, his expression and demeanor changed completely. He didn't look sad, just some sort of worried, and said that she had been gone now for a while. He didn't get any news or updates from the police. Something was off about the entire situation, but I could not put my finger on it. Not yet. We had finished the conversation. I told him I will come back again to ask some more questions, and began to leave the house. He remained sitting on the sofa. I was almost out the front door when I heard steps behind me. I thought he was following me, but when I turned around, he wasn't there. Instead, I saw a figure in a white dress approaching him. I pulled out my gun and slowly pointed it at the figure. when the man noticed the silhouette as well. He let out a horrifying scream at first. After the scream, I could hear him mumbling something about being impossible, and I heard him apologize. He was screaming that he is sorry. I was completely puzzled. Then, things became even more strange and unexplainable. The figure in the white dress grabbed the man by his neck and began choking him. I began to yell, commanding it to stop, but it did not listen. I took a shot, aiming at the shoulder, but the bullet passed right through it. Now I'm scared and confused, so I mindlessly fired 3 more rounds. All of them ended up going straight through. I charged with my body to grab the person or thing and went through it as well, hitting into the wall. My mind could not comprehend what had happened. I looked up. The figure was clearly a woman. Her face was expressionless and she did not speak. She stood there, choking the man before my very eyes. I could not do anything. I called for backup on my radio, but pretty soon, the man on the sofa had collapsed. The woman in the white dress released his body and began walking away towards the yard. I stood up, checked the man's pulse. He wasn't breathing. He was dead, so I decided to follow the woman. She walked away slowly without making a sound, toward the tree in the garden, and then finally vanishing. When I got to the tree, I saw the dirt under it, that it was different than the rest of the garden. I began digging with my bare hands. After a little while, the stench. I began digging even faster, and discovered a body. Rather a head, to be more precise. The skin was already decomposing, and half the flesh was devoured. When the paramedics arrived, they examined the man, and I could see my pile of vomit right next to it after I had found it. The reason of death was concluded to be asphyxiation, but there were no visible marks that would indicate somebody had strangled him. The only thing paramedics could conclude is that he had stopped breathing. But I know what happened. I don't know how it's possible, but I am certain that the ghost of his dead wife I sound so ridiculous even typing this out, but the ghost of his dead wife that was buried in the yard came back and had its revenge. For the rest of the police and doctors, this man's death will stay a mystery. I will not say what I saw. I would have my badge revoked and be sent off to the loony bin. Nobody would believe me. But after this, I believe that paranormal and ghosts are very, very real. As a kid, I dreamt of being an officer, like my father, and his dad before him. It kind of ran in the family. So, every time I was sitting in the passenger seat of my partner's cop car, it was even more special. It was my very first night, and my partner kept joking on me, ripping on me and calling me a rookie. But I didn't mind. I was very familiar with the hazing process. It was a boring night. My partner made attempts to break the silence by asking me all sorts of various questions. Other than that, it was silent. Not much was happening. We looked around for somebody to apprehend, but to no avail. So far, not much of a first day. We kept on driving with nothing happening, until I saw a figure standing on the corner. I told my partner, "Is that something there?" I pointed to the figure, who I can now see was a taller man standing with his head to the ground. She looked around for a bit before shaking her head and concluding it was probably just a homeless man. We drove off. I looked out the window as we passed. He turned his head and we watched as we drove off. I thought it was weird, but not weird enough to get involved. We kept on driving when we got a call on the radio. 5150 on South and Boulevard. My partner picked up the radio and told them we'd be on the way. I faintly remembered the 5150 from training. It had something to do with the crazies. We took a turn to get there faster and less time than I had imagined. We pulled into the house and property they had described over the radio, loaded our weapons, exiting the car. I looked around again, a very quick scan of the neighborhood. That's when on the corner, opposite of the one we had came in, I saw him again, the man from earlier, looking down at the floor. I tapped my partner and motioned towards him. She looked at him. I could tell she was just as confused as I was. She whispered to me, "You get in the house. I'll go talk to him." I nodded, heading into the house. It was huge, and to my knowledge, abandoned. "Hello, it's the police. Is anybody there?" Just then, from a heap on the floor, I heard somebody speak. "You need to leave now. Go." It was coming from a man holding a wound on his side, bleeding badly. "Sir, who did this to you?" I asked, flashing the flashlight in his direction. "Get out. Get your partner and get out of here before he gets mad," he said, fear audibly in his voice. "Who gets here?" I responded, hearing a little bit of fear in my own voice. He opened his mouth, but before he could speak, there was a gunshot that had got both of our attention. I ran outside to see my partner, now face down. The man she was talking to was nowhere to be found. I rushed out to her side, kneeling down beside her, flipping her over before checking her pulse. I felt nothing. To show her respect, I closed her eyes before setting her back down, unholstering my weapon. I walked back into the house, aiming it, but to my surprise, the now bleeding man was not there. The house was empty. In his spot was a streak of blood heading out the back door, which I saw now had been busted open. I ran through, looking around. There, in the corner of the fence, stood the tall man looking down. "All right, you freak, hands up." He didn't move. It's like my badge and gun meant nothing to him. He did not fear me. "What, are you hard of hearing?" I said, "Put your hands up," trying to make my voice sound more macho. "No, that's how we're playing it," I said, fed up. 1, 2. Before I could get to 3, he turned to me, looking at me. What I saw made me drop my weapon. His stare felt cold, but he could not be staring at me. There were 2 empty spots on his face where his eyes would usually go. I stumbled backwards into the house, nearly losing my balance but catching myself in the sink, vomiting a bit. I was still shaken up by everything that's happened. It all happened so quickly. I stood over the sink, waiting for the urge to vomit to make a reappearance, and I had heard footsteps approaching. It was the man I saw before. He came in, wiping the blood from his shirt. He was not injured at all. "I'm sorry. It was truly nothing personal," he claimed with a smug smirk on his face. "You see, my boy has this craving for human flesh, and a boy has got to eat." He continued to walk towards me. "What is wrong with his eyes?" I said frantically, considering I was more than likely going to die. He was born without them. Doctors can't explain it, but my boy didn't let it get him down. He doesn't need eyes. He goes by his hearing and his smell. He looked out the door, and here he comes now. I knew what was coming. Just thinking about that freakishly tall, eyeless man and my partner made me sick. I vomited, all over the man and myself. He took a step back, and called me a disgusting fool, explained to me that there will be no mercy. And I ran as fast as I could, grabbing my radio and calling for backup immediately. I actually had to drive down the street to try and hide from this person until my backup arrived. He and his son were detained, and as it turns out, he had actually cut out his son's eyes as a part of some sort of sick, satanic, sadistic cult, and fed him human flesh his entire life, treating him like a wild animal. As far as I know, him and his son are still serving time in prison. I have worked in law enforcement for the past 20 years. I began working for the sheriff department later moving to local police. I now work for the state police, but the following story happened during my time in local PD. For a period of time, I worked on patrol, usually spent most of my time on duty in the car or just generally outside. I used to work the night shift for a very long time, but it did get a little lonely at times. I would clock in at 10 p.m., and specifically this one night. My department sent me into a part of the city that I rarely ever went to. It was mostly peaceful, especially during the night, so I thought this would be a quiet shift. I slept well before coming to work, so with some coffee, I was pretty well rested and alert and ready. It became a habit of mine, so much that I had trouble staying awake for those rare occasions I worked morning shifts or during the day. I was also a single man at the time, so I could very easily adapt to my schedule, whatever my supervisor needed me to do. I clocked in that night, and everything was going smoothly. Most of the people were still awake and out and about, most returning to their homes, calling it a night. The first couple of hours passed pretty quickly. At around 12:30, it became very quiet. I kept driving around the city, checking that everybody was getting out of the streets. I drove for about an hour or two, and I came upon a group of kids, about 5 teenagers, sitting in a park, smoking cigarettes. After telling them to go home and quit smoking, I moved on with my job. A few blocks away, I came across a man stumbling in the street. I stopped next to him, asking him if he was okay or needed help. He told me that he'd had a bit too much to drink, but he was on his way home. Apparently, he lived across the street from where I stopped him. I let him go, watching him get inside. It took him a couple of minutes, but he eventually made it inside. I was on my way once again. This time of the night, we would usually receive complaints of loud parties, sometimes domestic disturbances. Tonight, however, was a bit different, and quite frankly, I was getting more bored by the minute. I heard some partners of mine go out and purposely try to open the doors of various businesses, making sure they're properly locked. I was considering trying it, to pass the time. If I had managed to get into the building, then I would have found a weakness and informed the owners. I was about to park my car and go out to check on a store when I heard the dispatcher calling out to everybody. I responded to the call. She reported that there had been a strange person wandering the streets, moving from alley to alley. My initial thoughts were it was probably somebody who was intoxicated. I would have to take him home or put him in the drunk tank. Well, I was very, very wrong. I arrived at the scene where they were last seen. It was a really cold night outside, and I was beginning to wonder if they had fallen asleep in one of the 3 small alleys right beside the main road. I decided to search each of them, starting from the first one. I drew out my gun and a flashlight and entered the first alleyway. It was pitch black. I shone a light in and saw that it was short, and it ended with a wall. There was nobody there. I moved on to the second one. It was similar to the first, except this one had a few trash cans. I slowly moved towards them. They looked like drops of blood around them. I'm still not sure what the dark liquid was, but it looked like blood to me. I reported what I saw and moved to the final alleyway. I know that by this point, whoever it was probably gone, but I had to take a look. I walked into the third alley and was genuinely surprised to find somebody there. I suspected that it had been the person reported. I announced myself and approached them. It was a tall, skinny man. He was bald and very pale. He was also hiding his face, but not in a way to hide his face from me. More like covering his eyes because the bright light bothered him. I managed to get a glimpse of his left eye. I think that my shock encouraged him to show me his entire face. I calculated my mistakes here, as well as my opportunities for the course of action. My first mistake was that he was not a he in the first place, or even human. He had bright yellow eyes and a large mouth, with multiple sets of sharp teeth protruding out. Look, my sister is really into Halloween and contact lenses for various costumes. I can tell a contact lens from a real eye. They were real and glowing. He, or it, opened its mouth, and I could see it also had these two fang-like teeth. My guess is that the blood I found before came from this person or creature or it. I also guess it was hurt. I had a feeling that human flesh was on its menu, but it had not yet attacked me. I heard my backup come right before our alleyway, and I slowly backed out to meet them, carefully keeping my eye on it. However, I took my eyes off it for roughly 10 seconds when my colleagues and I walked into the alleyway, and whatever you want to call it was gone. I don't know how it could have slipped up so fast, but it did. Instead, I took a sample of that blood-like liquid from before and took it to our labs for testing. The results came back really messed up. It was inconclusive. It appeared to be unidentified DNA. Working as a cop was simply one of the best decisions I've ever made in my life. I made good friends, had several adventures and encounters among other things. When I also retired, I did so with full honor and glory and no bad records. It was the best life and career I could ask for. However, while my job had its fair share of excitement and fun, it also had its hidden dangers. Most of these were often mild, with little to no deaths. If we were lucky, we got off with light injuries. However, I had an encounter that nearly cost my life. Nothing had prepared me for this terrifying encounter. Not even the rigorous training we received when we applied for the academy, nor the years of experience on the job itself had properly prepared me for this ordeal. That ordeal was one of the reasons I retired when I did. My mind was unable to handle the shock from that encounter. I was in the precinct with a few of my colleagues. They were on duty that day when we received a distress call. I went to check it out. I left the precinct while pondering on what the issues could be. The caller had only dropped an address before the line went off, so it was puzzling to say the least. Usually, these kind of calls are some of the worst. I located the house after a bit of asking around the place that it was located. It was in the deepest part of town. Notwithstanding, everybody seemed familiar with the place. At that point, countless alarm bells are going off in my head. This house was in a very secluded part of town, yet everybody knew it. This was strange. I wouldn't be surprised if one or two people knew about the place, but everybody seemed to know where the call came from. I guess the house was built in the old 1900s, and it had a very eerie ambiance around it. I could sense a sinister aura surrounding it, but I was not bothered. It was just my mind and paranoia trying to play tricks on me. I walked to the door and knocked. The answer I got was silence. I knocked again, stating who I was with more strength. Still, greeted by silence. At this point, the alarm bells were blaring non-stop in my head, but I still chose to ignore them. I've already gotten here. I can't just turn back without conducting a search or a proper investigation. When I had grown tired of knocking, I decided to barge in, and I heard the footsteps racing down the stairs. It was a middle-aged woman with a girl of about 15 years in tow. The woman opened the door with a smile, asked politely, "How may I help you, officer?" I told her somebody had called our precinct, gave the address to this house, so I decided to do a wellness check. The woman softly smiled and told me it was just the kids playing pranks. I couldn't help but glance at the girl behind her, who was silently mouthing the words, "Help me." It was at that juncture I knew that something was going on in that house, and this woman standing in front of me was either the perpetrator or an accomplice. In my mind, I concluded the matter to be a case of child trafficking or kidnapping. But little did I know that I was about to be thrown into a world that would shatter everything I knew. I was about to be thrown into a world that would decimate mine. I simply smiled at the woman, asked if I could come in to take a look. The smile at this point on her face receded, and she threw a glance at the girl behind. The girl trembled and retreated in fright, which further confirmed my suspicions that something sinister was going on. I took a step inside, taking a cursory glance at everything before turning to the girl. My intuition told me she had been the one to make the call that brought me here. I decided to make her talk so I could ascertain if the voice had been hers. "Hi, my name's Matthew. What's yours?" I had asked with a smile, trying to be chipper and polite. She only gave a frightful nod in response, declining to clearly talk. Again, another action firmly confirming my suspicions. She had indeed been the one to make the call to the precinct, and the look of terror on her face made me know that the woman standing behind me was clearly no saint. I turned to address her. "Ma'am, this child looks malnourished and starved. She's also in need of immediate medical attention. With your permission, I'd like to take her to the hospital." The moment I said those words, I could feel the temperature drop, and a cold shiver ran over my body. This look crept onto the woman's face, and her voice, which sounded like a demon from the depths of hell, awakened terror within me. All I felt was fear, a primal fear from the depths of my soul. Grabbing the girl, I rushed towards the door, only for it to snap shut, as if pushed by an invisible hand. The woman slowly began to shapeshift from a middle-aged woman into something ghastly and evil-looking. She gave this shrill cry, and her eyes retracted to these black shapes. The noise was high-pitched, making my ears nearly bleed. She raised her hands toward me, making me fly towards her. Terrified, I cannot describe how I felt. All I knew was I felt a pang of regret at that moment. This encounter had brought me face to face with a demon or a witch. She clenched her fist, and giving me the sensation that a hand had clutched onto my heart. I cried out in pain and silently prayed to God. In my pain, I didn't realize the girl was no longer behind me. I was busy, too busy, thinking of how to escape. Once again, ruthlessly, I was flung away like a rag doll, and it was at this moment I saw the girl. She was holding on to a crude crucifix. Stealthily, she went behind the woman and violently began stabbing her. With a cry of pain, the woman seemed to stop moving. I immediately radioed for backup, grabbing the girl, throwing her in my car, and driving to the station. My supervisor immediately began talking to her, while backup was taking care and cleaning up the situation. I was sent home for the night, and the next day when I went in for my shift, I was told I would no longer be working on that case, and did not speak about any of the details given. That was many years ago now, and now that I don't do it anymore, I feel the need to share this information. Hopefully it'll assist anybody out there with knowing that things beyond our realm of comprehension and understanding, rational thought, truly exist.